The letter arrived on a Tuesday in early February, and I almost didn't open it. It was sitting in the mailbox between a grocery flyer and a hydro bill, plain white envelope, with the name of my landlord's property management company printed in the top left corner. I knew what it was before I even touched it. You develop a kind of sixth sense for bad news when you've been bracing for it long enough. I stood there in the cold at the end of the driveway in Sudbury, Ontario, in my socked feet because I'd stepped out in a hurry, and I just stared at it. The snow had crusted over overnight, and it crunched under my weight as I shifted from foot to foot. 14 days. That's what it said inside. 14 days to pay the 3 months of rent I owed, or vacate the unit. My name is Jordan Solicitor, and until the previous spring, I had been doing fine. Not great, not by any stretch. But fine in the way that most guys my age in a mid-sized northern Ontario city understand fine to mean enough work to cover the basics, enough left over at the end of the month to not lie awake doing math. I'd been working as a millwright at a mining equipment servicing company on the edge of the city. The hours were long, the winters were brutal, and the smell of machine oil never really left my hands no matter how many times I washed them. But the pay was decent, the crew was good, and I had a one-bedroom apartment on Larch Street that was mine. That mattered more than I ever said out loud. Then in April, the company lost its biggest contract. The whole thing unraveled fast. They announced layoffs on a Wednesday. By Friday afternoon, I was cleaning out my locker. I filed for EI right away, and for a few months it helped. I applied for jobs constantly, maintenance positions, other plants, anything that required the certifications I had. Northern Ontario has a particular rhythm to its labor market, and I had spent enough years in it to know that timing mattered. Some doors were just closed. Not permanently, but closed. I told myself it was temporary, that something would come through. I told myself that a lot. By October, the EI had run its course. I had some savings, but they went faster than I thought possible. In the quiet, mundane way money disappears when you're not earning. Groceries, prescription, gas, phone bill, the dentist appointment I'd put off for 8 months and couldn't put off any longer. I asked my sister in Timmins if I could borrow enough to cover November's rent, and she sent what she could, and I hated that I'd asked, and I hated even more that it still wasn't enough to cover December too. By February, I owed 3 months, 14 days. I went back inside and put the letter on the kitchen table and didn't touch it for the rest of the day. I ate a bowl of cereal standing at the counter. I watched the snow come down outside the window, and I thought about what it would mean to pack everything I owned into my truck and drive to my sister's spare room and start over. I was 31 years old. I had a Red Seal certification, 5 years of experience, and I couldn't pay my rent. The shame of that is hard to explain to someone who hasn't felt it. It doesn't just sit in your chest. It follows you into every room. It changes the way you talk to people, the way you walk past your neighbors in the hallway, the way you look at yourself in the bathroom mirror in the morning, and have to decide whether to keep trying. I started making quiet plans, not because I'd given up, but because a part of me knew I had to be practical. I contacted a buddy in Sault Ste. Marie who mentioned there might be work out there in the spring. I started going through my belongings, sorting things in my head, what would fit in the truck, what I'd have to sell, what I'd leave behind. I didn't start putting things in boxes yet, but I thought about it. I thought about it every single day that first week. And if you've ever been in a place like that, where the future you planned for just stopped existing, and you're standing in the wreckage of it trying to figure out which direction to walk, then I want to ask you to take a moment right now and like this video. Share it with someone who might need to hear it. Leave a comment below and let me know where you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel. Because this story is about what happens when you're at the bottom looking up, and someone decides to look back. On the 9th day, I forced myself to call the property management office. I'd been avoiding it the way you avoid a hard conversation when you already know it's going to hurt. A woman named Rhonda answered. She was polite but careful, the way people are when they've been trained to be kind but not to make promises. She confirmed the notice, confirmed the timeline, and when I asked if there was any flexibility, she said she'd leave a message for the building owner, Mr. Sutherland, and that he would be in touch. He wasn't. Not that day, not the next one. On the 11th day, I came home from an interview at a facility in Chelmsford, maintenance technician, nothing glamorous, but I would have taken it gladly. And there was a woman standing in the building lobby. She looked to be in her early 70s with gray hair cut short and practical, the kind of face that seemed used to cold weather and making decisions. She was looking at a clipboard. When I came through the door stamping snow off my boots, she looked up. She asked if I was the tenant in Unit 6, Ed. She introduced herself as Shirley Sutherland. She told me she owned the building. I felt the floor drop slightly under my feet. I'd been expecting a formal process, a date, a knock from a sheriff's officer. Not this. Not her standing in the lobby with a clipboard and calm eyes, looking at me the way you look at something you're trying to figure out. She asked if we could talk. I said yes. We went upstairs. I didn't offer her tea because I didn't have much of anything in the fridge, and I didn't want the embarrassment of that showing too. But she didn't seem to want tea anyway. She sat down at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd set the eviction letter 11 days ago and hadn't moved it. And she looked at the apartment and she looked at me, and she asked me what had happened. There's a particular kind of stubbornness that comes from trying to hold yourself together for months. Pride is part of it, but it's also just exhaustion it alone that when someone asks a genuine question and actually waits for the answers, something in you just gives way. I told her everything, the layoffs, the EI, the savings disappearing, the interviews that went nowhere. I told her about asking my sister for money, which I hadn't told anyone else. I told her I had a red seal, 5 years of real experience, and that I wasn't someone who didn't want to work. I was someone who couldn't get back in the door. I talked for a long time. She didn't interrupt once. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said she was sorry about the job. She said it like she meant it, not like a formality. Then she told me something I hadn't known about her. Before Shirley had purchased the Larch Street building and the 2 others she owned in the city, she had spent almost 20 years working in employment support services. She'd run a workforce reintegration program through a local nonprofit that helped tradespeople and industrial workers get back into the labor market after layoffs or long gaps. Resume coaching, certification renewals, interview prep, industry connections. She'd stepped back from it 6 years ago when her husband got sick, and after he passed, she'd moved into real estate management as a way to have something to focus on. But lately, she told me, she'd been thinking about going back to that work. Not in a big way, just something meaningful. Then she looked at me and she made an offer that I still think about almost every day. She said she would suspend the eviction notice and hold the arrears, meaning I wouldn't owe the back rent in a lump sum right now. If I was willing to help her get something off the ground. She had been in contact with the local Employment Ontario office and a few community partners about relaunching a small, informal version of the workforce support program she used to run. Nothing like the scale of what she'd done before. Just a drop-in resource out of a storefront space she owned on Elm Street, where tradespeople and workers who'd been displaced could come for help with resumes, interview practice, certifications, and referrals to employers, who wasn't hiring. She said she needed someone on the ground, someone who understood the trades, who knew what it actually felt like to be on the other side of a layoff, someone who could sit with the people who walked in and speak their language. I stared at her for a long moment. I wasn't sure if I'd heard her correctly. Me, she was asking me. I told her I wasn't a social worker. I didn't have any training in that kind of work. I could fix a conveyor system or rebuild a hydraulic coupling in my sleep, but sitting across from strangers and talking them through job applications, that was something else entirely. She smiled, not a dismissive smile, a patient one, like she'd been expecting exactly that response. She said the people who'd be walking through that door wouldn't need a social worker. They'd need someone who'd stood where they were standing. I didn't sleep much that night, not because I was anxious, or not only because of that, but because something had shifted in a way I didn't have language for yet. A week earlier, I had been mentally calculating how to fit my life into the back of my truck. Now I was trying to figure out what I was actually being asked to do, and whether I was capable of it, and why this woman I had only just met seemed to think I was. I called her the next morning and told her I was in. The storefront on Elm Street was a former insurance office. Low ceilings, carpeted floor in a shade of beige that had seen better decades, fluorescent lights that buzzed slightly if you stood under them too long. Shirley had already gotten a few folding tables donated from a church hall and a handful of office chairs. There was a desktop computer that a local credit union had given them and a printer that worked about 70% of the time. We spent the first week cleaning the place up, moving furniture, taping up a whiteboard where we'd eventually write the week's workshop schedule. She handled the partnerships and the phone calls. I handled the space. The first person who came in was a guy named Patrick, 54 years old, who'd worked in underground mining for 30 years and been laid off when his company downsized its Northern Ontario operations. He sat down across from me at one of the folding tables with his arms crossed and said he didn't really know why he was there, because places like this never helped anyone. I told him I understood that. I told him I'd felt the same way every time I'd walked into a government office in the last 8 months. He looked at me like he was sizing something up, and then he uncrossed his arms and pulled out a folded-up piece of paper that was his resume, and we spent 2 hours going through it together. That became the shape of my days. People came in with paper bags full of certification documents they didn't know how to organize, with resumes that listed 30 years of experience, but didn't know how to speak to a hiring manager, with gaps in employment they were ashamed of, not realizing that half the labor market had the same gaps and no one was looking at them the way they feared. I helped where I could, and when I couldn't, I called Shirley. She always knew who to call next. It was the most tired I'd been in months. It was also the first time in months I'd gone to bed feeling like the day had meant something. About 6 weeks in, a woman named Sandra came in. She was 37, a licensed electrician, and had been out of the workforce for 2 years after a serious injury on a job site and a long recovery. She was nervous, apologetic in the way people get when they feel like they've become a burden to a process, and she kept saying she wasn't sure if she qualified for anything we offered. I told her there were no qualifications to walk through the door. We sat down. We talked. Sandra's situation was complicated by the fact that her injury had temporarily limited some of her mobility, and she wasn't sure how to disclose that to potential employers or whether she even had to. I didn't know the legal specifics, so I helped her connect with a workers' rights advisor through Employment Ontario. 2 weeks later, she came back to tell me she'd had a meeting with an electrical contractor in the city who specialized in residential work and who had told her that with some accommodation adjustments that were minor on his end, she was exactly the kind of experienced, licensed electrician he'd been looking for. I watched her walk out of that office looking completely different than when she'd walked in, and I understood then what Shirley had been trying to tell me the night she sat at my kitchen table. You don't need credentials to do this work. You need to have been through something hard enough that you remember what it feels like to be on the other side of a desk, where no one seems to understand what you're actually dealing with. That memory turns out to be one of the most useful things you can offer someone. In March, I got a call from a man named David Kowalski. He ran a mid-sized industrial maintenance company with operations in Sudbury and Greater Sudbury area, and he'd heard about the resource center through one of the Employment Ontario contacts Shirley had built relationships with. He told me he'd been having trouble finding certified millwrights with hands-on experience. Not entry-level people, but experienced tradespeople who'd been out of the workforce due to circumstances and needed a re-entry point. He asked if we had anyone on our roster who might fit. I had 3 people who matched almost exactly what he described. I referred all 3. He hired 2 of them within the month. On the day the second one texted me to tell me she'd gotten the call, I was sitting in my truck in the parking lot behind the Elm Street office eating a sandwich. I read the message twice. Then I sat there for a while, not doing anything in particular, just sitting with it. I thought about the eviction letter on my kitchen table. I thought about standing in my socked feet in the February cold holding that envelope. I thought about the 9th day, when I made myself call the property management office because there were only 5 days left and I was running out of options. And I thought about Shirley sitting at my table with her clipboard set aside, asking me what had happened and waiting, actually waiting for the answer. A few weeks after that, David called again. Not about a referral this time. He said one of the guys I'd sent him had mentioned in passing that I had a red seal and 5 years of millwright experience, and he asked me if I'd be open to coming in for a conversation. I almost said I was too busy. That's the honest truth. The center had become something I didn't want to step away from, even for a day, because every day someone new came in, and every day it felt like something mattered. But Shirley told me, gently and without any fuss, that taking care of my own stability was not a betrayal of the work. She said that more than once, actually. She had a way of saying the thing you needed to hear, before you knew you needed to hear it. I went in and talked to David. He offered me a position as a senior maintenance technician, with a possibility of moving into a supervisory role within the year. Benefits, full-time, stable hours. I signed the offer letter in his office on a Wednesday afternoon in early April. I sat in my truck afterward and I thought about the fact that exactly 2 months earlier, I had 14 days to figure out what to do with the rest of my life. Here's what I didn't expect. The center didn't need me to leave it just because I went back to work. Shirley had by then brought on a part-time coordinator, a woman named Beth who had a background in HR and had been volunteering with them since January. The operation was real now. Workshops twice a week, a growing list of employer partnerships, a connection with the college's continuing education program for certification renewals. I started coming in on Saturday mornings, sometimes Wednesday evenings, not because I owed it, because I wanted to. Before I get to where things stand now, I want to ask you to do something. Scroll down to the comments right now and tell me where you're watching from. And tell me about one moment when a stranger did something, big or small, that changed the direction of your day or your week or your life. I read every comment, and I promise you, hearing those stories means more than you might think. It's been 2.5 years since Shirley knocked on my door. Or didn't knock on my door, technically. She was in the lobby, and I found her there by accident. I think about that a lot. How much of this came down to the fact that I came home from Chelmsford at exactly the right time, and she was standing there. The Elm Street Employment Resource Center, that's what it's officially called now, after they registered it properly, has helped over 300 people in Sudbury find work since it opened. The number sounds large until you meet even one of them and understand what it took for them to walk through the door in the first place. Patrick, the mining veteran who came in with his arms crossed, is now working as a safety trainer for the same industry he spent 30 years in. Sandra, the electrician, got promoted to job site lead last fall. The center is currently in conversation with 2 other Northern Ontario communities about replicating the model. None of it started with funding, none of it started with a plan. It started with a landlady who looked at a tenant who owed 3 months of rent and decided to see a person instead of a problem. It started with an offer that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with believing that the people who've struggled the hardest are sometimes the ones best equipped to help others through the same. I still live on Larch Street. I paid back the arrears by the end of last year, little by little. Shirley didn't ask me to rush it. She never mentioned it once. I brought her a check one afternoon, and she accepted it the same way she accepts most things, quietly, without making it a bigger moment than it needed to be. But here's the thing I'll carry with me probably for the rest of my life. The day she sat across that kitchen table from me and made her offer, she wasn't solving my problem. She was handing me the tools to solve it myself and taking a bet on the idea that I could. That's a different thing entirely, and if you've ever had someone take that kind of bet on you, really bet on you, not out of pity but out of genuine belief, then you know that it doesn't just change your circumstances. It changes something in you that circumstances alone never could. If this story found you at a moment when you needed it, please like the video and share it with someone who might be in the middle of their own 14 days. Subscribe to the channel for more stories like this one, and leave a comment. I mean it. Tell me where you are in the world, and tell me about someone who believed in you when you weren't sure you believed in yourself. Those are the stories worth keeping.